When people talk about the factions in Fallout, it almost always boils down to the big ones featured in the games, like the Master, Brotherhood of Steel, New California Republic, Enclave, or Caesar's Legion. Often overlooked are the great pre-war powers that dominated Earth before the bombs dropped, those being the Soviet Union, European Commonwealth, Middle East Coalition, China, and the United States of America. Each played an important role in the geopolitics of the era and dominated large spheres of influence that spilled over into the massive conflicts that characterized the Resource Wars, eventually leading to the Great War of 2077 that brought all to their knees. But before we get too far into this video, I'm going to ask you to leave a like, comment, and subscribe down below. Every little bit helps get more of my content out into the world for more people like yourself to enjoy. The Soviet Union still stood well into the 21st century during the Fallout timeline. The Union was probably composed of 15 republics that are spread out between Eastern Europe and Western Asia, just like a real-life version. It was the first and largest communist country by landmass, as it stretched from Belarus in Eastern Europe to Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean, and by 2077 had an estimated population of roughly 300 million. Its origins came in 1917, during the overthrow of the Tsarist Imperial Russian government in March, then the interim government in November of that year that sparked a bloody 4-year-long civil war between the White and Red Russians. But the country was not officially established until 1922, when the Red Russians won under Vladimir Lenin. We do not know much about the Soviet Union and Fallout, which will be a recurring theme for most of this episode, but we can speculate on what we do see. First of all, the nation was locked in a decades-long ideological struggle known as the Cold War with the United States, where both nations fought each other through proxies across the globe with an ultimate goal of undermining the other's global influence. But sometime during the more than a century-long staring contest, the Soviet Union's influence began to wane, and China stepped up to take their place as the primary communist threat. This probably occurred in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Assuming the rest of the world also stagnated culturally in the 1950s, we can get a snapshot of life there. Pre-1953, during the Stalin era, the Soviet Union would have been very strict and outright hostile towards the West, with a hardline communist stance where secret police stalked the streets abducting civilians for minor infractions to be sent to the gulags. While post-53, in what we know today as the Khrushchev era, the Soviet Union de-Stalinized, allowing its citizens slightly more freedom than before. This had led me to theorize that the Soviet Union may no longer be called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in Fallout, but renounced communism and rebranded as the Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics by the 2000s, effectively throwing the shackles of socialism off and embracing some aspects of capitalism through a process called perestroika, or reform in English, that was aimed at reviving the economy through opening the country up. And glasnost, or openness, made the government more transparent so people would have confidence investing their money here. These policies were implemented because the economy was failing, with basic necessities like toilet paper always being out of stock, but foreign companies were not confident in the country to fill the need until both of these policies were implemented. I believe this resulted in a relationship that was not friendly, but not overly hostile, forming between America and the USSR, where both countries still eyed one another from their corners of the earth, but are no longer trying to topple one another, as their primary focus have changed to more pressing threats. With one assumption, we can create a basic timeline of events that shaped the Soviet Union. That being, if the world's culture stagnated in the late 1950s during the Khrushchev era, would almost guarantee perestroika and glasnost to take place in a last-ditch effort to retain the Union when the economy began to topple, just like what happened in our world, but this time it was successful. This would soften the tension between the United States and the USSR and allow a warm enough relationship where the consul exists in Los Angeles, despite the Sino-American War consuming the entire Pacific, a conflict that embodies the struggles between capitalism and communism. The most prominent Soviet character we know of may have been you. We are talking about Natalia Dubrovsky, a prefabricated player character from Fallout 1, living in Vol 13 in 2161, who was the daughter of a Soviet diplomat in the Los Angeles consulate. She is sleek, beautiful, and sly, with her main strength being stealth to sneak past threats rather than tackling them head-on. The other characters with significance and outstanding Soviet lineage are the Babrov twins, who immigrated to the Commonwealth from the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Both still have their thick Ukrainian accents, and support support the Soviet stereotype of peddling copious amounts of alcohol, but with an American twist called Babrov's Best Moonshine, which they sell from their establishment, the Dugout Inn. The European Commonwealth is a collection of nations that operated under a single banner to better establish themselves in the tumultuous politics and global affairs of the 21st century. It is unknown when the European Commonwealth formed, but we can assume it operated in a similar manner to the real-life European Union, with the headquarters located in Western Europe, where representatives of member states meet to make policy. At first, I assume the European Commonwealth started out to promote economic cooperation between member nations by allowing free trade and travel with one another, and giving the collective a much louder voice on the global stage, especially when working together at the UN. But it appears that before the 2050s, when oil prices skyrocketed and the world began to slip into chaos, the European Commonwealth would become the governing body of Europe and was able to call on a powerful military from each member state at the individual country's expense. This probably came about as an emergency measure to ensure European independence from foreign powers, both from invasion and what was seen as unreasonable economic practices, which was the excuse given for the invasion of the Middle East in 2052. As oil prices continued to rise, the Europeans struck out to secure the Arabian oil fields for themselves in a desperate act to save their continent. The first 2 years of war were widely successful, with the European armies cutting deep into the Middle East, but everything stalled in January 2054 when the Israeli city of Tel Aviv was destroyed with a terrorist nuclear weapon that sparked a brief but brutal nuclear exchange across the Middle East, leaving many of the great cities here like Baghdad, Alexandria, Kabul, and Dubai as radioactive ruins. This single act bogged the war down into a quagmire and sparked heated debates in the UN that eventually led to its dissolvement as most countries withdrew, leaving no international body to mediate the next 6 years of war when finally the Arabian oil fields ran dry, making the entire war pointless and bankrupting the European Commonwealth, which began to fracture shortly afterwards into bickering nation states desperate for any resources they get their hands on. It is unknown if the European Commonwealth survived after the Euro-Middle East War, but if it did, this core would be made up of Germany, France, and the UK, who would try and weather the economic collapse, using what they could to stay afloat, including annexing their collapsed neighbors. But the state of Europe could only be described as third world, with very little energy resources to use outside of coal and wood. What remained of Europe would practically be thrown back into the 1800s without oil, and fall to harsh authoritarianism in an effort to retain order. Although their technological prowess was still world class, with many inventions and the minds behind them residing in Europe. The role the European Commonwealth played in the Great War cannot be understated, however, as their greatest adversary now is probably the Soviet Union on the doorstep, so it would not surprise me if it was later learned that the European Commonwealth and Soviet Union had their nukes aimed at each other and were the cause of the other's atomic destruction. A few European characters have appeared in the Fallout series so far, Alistair Tenpenny and Stanislaus Braun being the standout characters. Tenpenny is a British man who sailed across the Atlantic to seek his fortune in the capital wasteland. He eventually founded Tenpenny Towers with the riches he made, turning it into a luxurious and exclusive settlement for those wealthy enough to meet Alistair's standards. The building is the only large freestanding structure around and is located on the outskirts of DC, overlooking Megaton in the distance, which he wished to destroy with a namesake bomb, as he views Megaton as a blight in his otherwise pristine view, giving a glimpse at the demented and shallow personality of this evil man. Stanislaus Braun was a German genius pre-war, who was one of Voltek's greatest minds and responsible for many of the company's breakthrough inventions, notably the Garden of Eden creation kits that were supposed to revitalize the wasteland after the nuclear bombs ravaged it. Braun was assigned as the overseer of Vault 112, where the residents were kept in a suspended animation entertained through virtual reality that Braun had control over. But after many years of peaceful existence, the man became bored and his sinister side emerged. He took a liking to torturing his dwellers in the simulation, making everyone suffer for his own sick pleasure before killing and wiping the memory to start all over again. The Middle East Coalition formed as a reaction to the invasion by Europe in 2050s. The coalition would fight a losing war against the European Commonwealth for the first 2 years before a terrorist organization would commit the worst act in history when the city of Tel Aviv was destroyed with a nuclear weapon. This act was a blessing and a curse for the coalition, as it stunned the Europeans and shocked the world. But soon retaliation came when European Commonwealth bombers nuked cities across the Middle East, so the coalition responded in turn and bombed the European occupied cities in a massive exchange that drew the war to a standstill, as neither side wanted to escalate this further. The leaders of the Middle East would use this time to shore up their defenses while heated debates raged in the United Nations over the war. The body divided itself into factions. Some backed the Europeans while others sided with the Middle East coalition, and yet more wanted nothing to do with the war as their countries were failing, starting a heated debate that led to the collapse of the United Nations. Euro-Middle East War would go on for another 6 years, but the European Commonwealth would never gain initiative again, dragging the war on until 2060 when the Arabian oil fields finally ran dry, making the entire conflict pointless, and so the Europeans went home, leaving the Middle East as a radioactive wasteland. We do not know what happened after this, but we can make some assumptions. The complete and utter destruction of so many cities would have extremely heavy consequences for this region of the world, economically, environmentally, religiously, and politically. More than likely, the entire region collapsed into near total anarchy shortly after the war ended, with so many population centers decimated and industry wrecked. Economic collapse is almost inevitable, especially when you realize that many water sources and most land would be helplessly contaminated, which would lead to total anarchy taking over as faith in government institutions would be lost. This would be especially true because importing anything at the time was far too expensive, and without industry to trade goods, both water and food would dwindle into scarcity, leading to mass starvation and riots as famine swept through the Islamic world, more than likely leading to the Middle East regressing into a primitive state and the role in the Great War questionable. This is because their nuclear stockpiles would have already been exhausted during the war with the Europeans, and when it did kick off, a local exchange between warring factions would have occurred, leaving the contribution to the near genocide limited to the Middle East and possibly India. China was an all-consuming force in the 21st century, but the origins of the country come from the mid-20th century when the communists drove the nationalists out during the Chinese Civil War. This took place between 1927 and 1949, but was put on pause when Japan invaded in 1937 and started the Second Sino-Japanese War that then spilled over into World War II before picking up again in 1945. The country overtook the Soviet Union in the 21st century as America's primary geopolitical opponent on the global stage. So if the same assumptions we apply to the Soviets are placed on China, that divergence would have happened during the height of Mao Zedong's power when he was at the heart of every decision in the country. And we can see the legacy of this hardline authoritarian state in the China we see in Fallout, a single party state where all power is held by the chairman, in this case Chiang, who ruled China with an iron fist from at least 2063. The resource shortage hit China particularly hard, especially since they were still entirely reliant on fossil fuels to power their economy. When the sudden and rapid jump in oil prices brought their society to a crawl, the CCP probably lashed out in desperation, just like the European Commonwealth, more than likely invading its neighbors to secure resources while the rest of the world was preoccupied with the Middle East nuclear crisis, starting with those to the south in Indochina and probably reaching all the way down into Indonesia and the Philippines with the hope of oil and to capture the entirety of the South China Sea for itself. But what little remained was quickly sucked dry, and so China would turn north to begin a conquest of the Siberian Far East, probably starting a brief war with the Soviets, who ultimately would have seen the futility of it and ceded the mostly barren land. These land grabs bloated the population beyond 2 billion to give China a near limitless pool of people to draw from, but also many more mouths to feed. We can justify these annexation assumptions by what China would do in 2066. With the Persian oil fields all but gone and global trade at a standstill, the communists were desperate. Despite their massive land grabs, China was still struggling for resources, so the nation set its eyes on the last known accessible oil fields on Earth, in Alaska. The Sino-American War started in early 2066 when Chinese paratroops were dropped around Anchorage in a surprise attack. Since neither military had the resources for war mobility, most soldiers had very little armor to support on either side, so China was able to slowly chip away at the American defenders for the first years of the war, gradually pushing closer and closer to the city by simply overwhelming the Americans in their way with sheer numbers, until reaching the outskirts of Anchorage by year's end. Then everything came to a sudden halt in early 2067 when America deployed the first T-45 suits of power armor onto the battlefield. This stopped the Chinese dead in their tracks and forced both sides to dig vast trench systems around the war-torn city. Here the war would fester for the next 9 years, neither side able to take the initiative as they battled it out in ice, snow, and mud. On the battlefields, China relied on mass wave attacks over no man's land to try and break through the American trenches, while on the home front, heavy emphasis was placed on stealth research, eventually leading to the creation of the cloaking Huguei suits that could turn nearly invisible and were heavily used by the namesake Huguei units to wreak havoc in the rear lines on espionage and sabotage operations. But when neither of these were able to break the line, China would switch to biological and chemical weapons out of desperation. Yet still, the Chinese were unable to break through American lines, and so a long-lasting stalemate set in, one where Chinese soldiers threw themselves towards the Americans in massive wave attacks that made the Sino-American War eclipse the brutality of the Western Front of World War I or any battlefield before it on land. While at sea, the Chinese Navy was heavily invested in stealth technology as well, just like its army counterpart. The Chinese People Liberation Army Navy dumped many of their resources into creating the Ghost Fleet. These were ballistic missile stealth submarines that were invisible to radar and prowled the oceans in secret late in the war, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting targets or worse, to attack America if called upon to do so with their nuclear missiles. The project was kept almost entirely secret throughout the war, with only the DIA's predictive analytic machine having a 91% likelihood that stealth technologies were being studied, but severely underestimating the progress that had already been made, and without supporting data, the theory was discarded. This left the Ghost Fleet to haunt the oceans unmolested and guaranteed a retaliatory strike. But that was neither now nor prudent to the main events of the era, because in 2074 American Marines landed in Shantou after their successful conquest of the Philippines, bringing the war home to China in a counter-invasion that threw the Chinese Communist Party into panic and drew much of the military focus away from Anchorage to the home front to defend their country. The Chinese were able to stunt the invasion for a while and keep the Marines bottled up around Shantou and the other landing points, such as Nanking, for almost 2 years. But by 2076, the war took a turn for the worse when America deployed new weapons that broke the Chinese siege and allowed Marines to run wild through the countryside. This brought the country to its knees, as American armored units cut through any Chinese soldiers like a hot knife through butter during their march through the country. Some made it as far as the Gobi Desert in Shanghai in a stunning time, and by the end of the year, the Chinese had been pushed out of Anchorage, meaning that the war was now being fought entirely on the Chinese mainland, pressed the nation onto its last legs, and many thought the war would be over by Christmas. But any talk of that was quickly silenced on October 23, 2077. Chinese submarines had positioned themselves near major American cities and were lying in wait when bombers crossed the Bering Strait very early in the morning. And then at 9:17, the first Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles were launched in a surprise first strike on America. This created a cascade event where every nuclear-capable nation across the world launched their nukes in a mad frenzy that destroyed civilization with dozens of warheads targeting each city. The destruction was near total, and the fate of China is unknown. But a few Chinese have appeared in the game. Some, like the interned at Little Yangtze and Turtle Detention Center, were prisoners of war or suspected Chinese spies detained at military facilities across the United States and used for human experimentation, while others, like the remnant Chinese, are stranded Chinese special operations soldiers who were deployed to America to conduct covert mission. The remnants in Washington, D.C. were deployed there to spy on the Capitol and possibly attempt to assassinate government officials, while those in the deep of Appalachia had the objective of breaking into the White Springs bunker and securing the advanced technologies within for the People's Republic. Captain Zhao and the crew of the Yangtze 31 were one of the many stealth submarines that prowled the coasts of America on that fateful day. The submarine attacked Boston with its strategic nuclear weapons, but was crippled soon after when it struck a mine that severely damaged the reactor, forcing the Yangtze into Boston Harbor. But the radiation soon killed or ghoulified the crew, all of whom went feral except for Captain Zhao. A similar event took place across the country and San Francisco when another Chinese submarine was stranded in American waters following the Great War, but this time their crew settled within the city and utilized their technical prowess as engineers to trade and repair technology for a living. These were the Shi, a little slice of Chinese culture in the American wasteland, who were ruled by their enigmatic emperor, which was in fact the submarine's mainframe. Finally is Ma Shu and her daughter Jin, a former Chinese spy and illegitimate child who had had the veil lifted from her eyes about the truth of the world when its destruction occurred. Ma Xu lost faith in the communist cause, so she defied her strict orders of celibacy and fell in love with another former Chinese spy. Ma Xu thought she had escaped her life, but other agents still loyal to Beijing hunted her down using the trackers and her equipment and gave an ultimatum: continue with her mission or see her husband and daughter killed. So she abandoned her young daughter and husband overnight to protect them, leaving both to assume she had died while scavenging. The United States was the dominant military power on Earth ever since the Second World War. Its military might backed the Western world up, securing peace and democracy during the century-and-a-half-long Cold War between Western capitalist democracies and Eastern communist autocracies. At least that was until the resource wars began, when self-interest trumped shared ideologies and the United States focused inwards. American culture stagnated in the mid-1950s. This colored the nation to have a distinct personality and image unique among the rest of the world, who at the time was struggling to recover after the horrors of World War II. America was thriving in the post-war boom that made even the darkest of days have an optimistic shine to them. Yet through this, the country's main adversary was the Soviet Union, and both would play a treacherous international game of chess, using proxies to fight the other's influence for the next several decades. Conflicts like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, but at some point, the Soviet Union went into a steep decline and was surpassed by China as public enemy number one. This probably occurred in the late 1990s or early 2000s, as discussed in the Soviet section. From here, China and America would become mortal enemies and battle each other in the hearts and minds of smaller nations, trying to garner ever greater influence. But just as important to both countries was espionage on one another, especially after the resource wars began. A complicated spy game was played out where both nations would send agents into the other country to infiltrate and spy on sensitive projects. This was done to either sabotage their work or steal data for their own developments. The most infamous case of this was when Chinese agents stole a bioweapon from Hoover Dam, codenamed Limit 115, and leaked it during a gunfight with American agents in Denver, Colorado, kickstarting the new plague across America that forced a national quarantine to be enacted in 2053 and killed over 200,000 Americans in its 3 deadly waves. Yet despite the Chinese threat being ever present, the Reds took a temporary backseat when the resource crisis struck. This started in 2042 after the Texas oil fields ran dry and brought American culture to a crawl. Highways became congested with abandoned vehicles after they ran out of fuel and prices shot through the roof, leading to the American intervention in Mexico in 2051, where Congress used the instability of its southern neighbor as justification for American soldiers to march into Mexico City to depose the leadership and instate a new president that was friendlier to the US. This was all to ensure Mexican oil continued to flow across the border and resulted in Mexico effectively coming under American domination as a satellite state of its much more powerful neighbor. Canada would also feel the pressure in the early 2060s and eventually relented to American threats of force and promises of oil if American soldiers could both protect the Alaskan pipeline and move material through their country to build the Anchorage front line. This was a defensive military emplacement around Anchorage, Alaska to protect it from a potential invasion, as this was the last major oil producing location on the planet. But America's near exclusive access was not held for long, because in early 2066 China launched a surprise attack on Anchorage, which caught America off guard and threw the nation onto the back foot. The war would be long and bloody, lasting 11 hard-fought years, yet through it American ingenuity shined when the T-45 series of power armor was first deployed onto the battlefield in 2067 and stopped the Chinese march towards the city. This showed the basic differences between the Chinese and American militaries. America emphasized quality for its soldiers, while China focused on quantity of soldiers and stealth for its special operative. US soldiers and Marines had unrivaled firepower to back them up and wore full-body modular combat armor with the most advanced technologies at their backs: militarized robotics, artificial intelligence, laser and plasma weapon, and much more to fight this war with, like the legendary T-45 power armor, which was originally devised as a way to support tanks and armored units on the offensive, but with the massive fuel shortages, most tanks and armored vehicles became impossible to operate, especially in the frozen wasteland of Alaska. But the T-45 wasn't adequate to fill the armored role all by itself, because its design was rushed and left much to be desired, mainly in poor mobility and unbalanced weight, so the suit would mostly stay in the defensive role for now, supporting infantry and breaking up Chinese attacks by utilizing the one thing this suit excelled in: heavy ordnance. power armor allowed a single man to operate cruise-served weapons like a minigun or M2 50 caliber machine gun, bringing heavy fire support directly onto the front lines by a single man. The war would be attritional, with very little to show on their Anchorage front for nearly 10 years until 2076, but the US Navy reigned supreme over the Pacific between the start and end of the war. This enabled the United States to capture the Philippines and use it as a staging ground to launch a counter-invasion of China in 2074. Despite their claims of fighting a defensive war, this theater quickly bogged down like Alaska, but its intended purpose was to split China's focus onto multiple fronts and weaken their tenuous hold on Anchorage. Yet the Shantou and Nanking battlegrounds would be stalemates, with the T-45 armored forces there being bogged down and contained to the beachheads as they desperately held on as wave after wave of Chinese soldiers crashed against the Marines like an endless tsunami of bodies. During this time, though, America would place more and more pressure onto Canada to utilize their resources. Entire swaths of forest would be clear-cut and mountains cannibalized to feed the war effort, while American soldiers moved freely through the country in the name of protecting American interests. Many statesides began to refer to Canada as Little America, and the idea of annexation was floated a few times but never officially proposed until the Alaskan pipeline was bombed by Canadian radicals in 2076 and General Braxton began the official invasion of Canada. The Canadian military was swept aside along with any opposition. Annexation would be complete by 2077, which brought all of Canada into the American fold and gave the United States limitless access to all of the resources and an expanded population of roughly 400 million. And with that, martial law was imposed on the Canadian territories, with a death penalty given out to those who resisted, which gives interesting insight into the American government at this point in history. At a cursory glance, there appears to be very little difference between the authoritarian single-party regimes in China and the elected oligarchy of America. Basic human rights had been severely eroded throughout the Sino-American War, and now with the annexation and utter domination of Canada, the government has shown its hand publicly that human life means nothing to them, just the same as their Chinese counterparts. This nonchalant sentiment for human life has been festering across the United States for some time now, especially after the collapse of the United Nations, particularly in the fields of science and engineering, which gave America massive technological leaps for companies like WestTech, who no longer had to comply with international or federal laws that were seen as hindrances to progress, and so the corporation had a free hand to conduct their business as they saw fit, just as long as they reached or exceeded contract goals. This is how the forced evolutionary virus came to be, through extensive and unethical human experimentation on unwilling test subjects like those in Huntersville and at the Mariposa military base. But WestTech's greatest creation was the T-51 suit of power armor, completed in 2075 and first deployed in 2076 to great effect. It was lighter, better protected, more maneuverable, and more reliable than its T-45 predecessor, giving America the edge it desperately needed to finally break the stalemate and begin a lightning war of mobility. This crippled China, especially when Anchorage was liberated in January of 2077, and the entire might of the American war machine bore down on their homeland, with major cities like Shanghai and Nanking falling in days. Chinese soldiers and material couldn't be moved quick enough to counter American gains, and so China kept getting pushed further and further back into their country, creating a nightmare for the CCP and breakthrough for America, who could now pursue the war on their terms, and the United States wanted the conflict over with. What happened next, nobody can say for certain. The American people believed that the Sino-American War was finally over and that they had won, while the secret shadow government, the Enclave, had already relocated to remote shelters with the knowledge that the war was about to go nuclear. Who fired the first missile is unknown. Many within the shadow government believed it was China in the last act of Pyrrhic defiance, but the result was the same. The world would crumble in hellfire on October 23, 2077. Most cities across the globe obliterated in a single massive exchange of nuclear weapons that lasted only 2 hours, killing millions on that day alone and billions as society crumbled in the harsh aftermath of nuclear war that made survival the greatest challenge. Ultimately, the great powers would all fall on that fateful day. The entire quarter-century struggle for resources prior, made irrelevant by the power of the atom, that plunged humanity from its pinnacle of success down deep into the darkest of lows. What do you think of the pre-war great powers? Did you enjoy my analysis and speculation, sprinkled with bits of our history mixed in? How do you think these countries operated in the 2070s? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe as well, and I will see you in the next video, which will be about the pre-war United States military as voted on on by my lovely subscribers.